General Hospital spoilers reveal that Willow could feel the walls closing in long before she dared to admit it to herself, a suffocating pressure tightening around her every time Drew entered the room. Every time his voice shifted into that unsettlingly calm tone that made her skin prickle with dread. She had once seen Drew as a protector, a force of stability, someone who could anchor her whenever her life seemed to drift into chaos. But after the shooting and the long period of uncertainty, she began to understand that the man standing before her was no longer the one she believed she knew. His presence had shifted into something almost predatory, not in a physical sense, but in the way he watched her, in the way his eyes narrowed with suspicion he didn't want to admit, in the way his questions grew sharper, calculated, and terrifyingly precise. He didn't remember everything, but something inside him, some instinct sharpened by trauma and survival, sensed that Willow was carrying a secret far darker than anything she had ever confessed to anyone. It was this silent interrogation, this constant emotional siege, that pushed Willow to the brink of collapse, making her feel as if she were trapped in a maze with no exit, breathing air that grew thinner every time Drew looked at her for a second too long. She tried to pretend, tried to rebuild the facade of innocence she once wore so effortlessly, but the weight of her guilt pressed too heavily on her shoulders. Every night she lay awake replaying the moment she pulled the trigger, feeling the kickback in her arm, hearing the thud of Drew's body hitting the floor, reliving the horrifying clarity of realizing that she couldn't take that moment back. She told herself she had no choice. She told herself that Drew had taken too much from her, twisted her life into something she could barely recognize, and that she had simply snapped under a pressure she didn't know how to carry. But each time she looked at him now, each time she saw the faint scars and the subtle tension in his posture, the truth rose inside her like acid. And because Drew was too close, too aware, too instinctively connected to her emotional shifts, she could no longer hide her trembling hands or the flicker of panic that crossed her eyes whenever he stood too near. In this tightening web of fear and guilt, Willow began to seek refuge in the most unexpected place. Nina, the woman she once resented, distrusted, shut out at every turn, suddenly became the only person whose presence didn't make her chest feel like it was collapsing. Nina's concern, once overwhelming and suffocating in its own way, now felt like a lifeline, a rare warmth in an otherwise frozen world. Willow found herself drawn to her mother, not because she wanted to reconcile, but because her instinct screamed that Nina was the only person who might save her from whatever unraveling fate awaited her. Nina had a softness that Willow had once interpreted as weakness, but now she recognized it for what it truly was: resilience, compassion, and an unyielding protectiveness that could withstand even the darkest truths. The more Willow struggled to hold her secret inside, the more she found herself watching Nina with a desperation she didn't fully understand, as if her mother were the only barrier between her and the collapse she felt coming. This shift, this strange emotional reorientation, was one of the new adjustments unfolding inside Willow's fractured psyche. She no longer saw Nina as a rival or a threat, but as a sanctuary, someone who might cradle her truth rather than crush her with it. And the longer Willow carried the weight of her guilt, the more this internal transformation became undeniable. She was losing her grip on self-control. Her emotions were becoming erratic, flashes of paranoia mixed with sharp waves of remorse. There were moments when she nearly confessed without meaning to, moments when her lips parted mid-sentence and she had to swallow the words before they escaped. And the terrifying thing was that each time, she felt less resistance to the idea of confessing. It was as if some part of her mind, the part that wanted to break free of the invisible chains tightening around her wrists, was urging her to tell Nina everything, to rip open the wounds she had tried so desperately to stitch closed. The psychological chokehold Drew held over her, whether intentional or not, grew more disturbing with each passing day. He began asking more questions about the night of the storm, questions with edges, questions that felt like blades pressed against her throat. His memory returned in fragments, each shard sharp enough to hurt her, each vague recollection pushing him closer to the truth. Willow could feel him circling her like a man hunting something he couldn't yet identify, and she knew that once the pattern connected in his mind, once his intuition dug up the final piece, she would be destroyed. She felt his suspicion growing, felt his perception sharpening, and with every word he spoke, she sensed him stepping closer to a revelation that would shatter both of them. It was Nina who noticed first. Nina who saw the way Willow's hands shook when she picked up a coffee cup. Nina who caught the suppressed panic in her daughter's eyes. Nina who felt the tension radiating from Willow, like a tremor threatening to erupt into a full-scale quake. And Nina, despite everything, despite the past hurts, despite the countless times Willow had pushed her away, leaned in rather than retreating. Willow could see the confusion, the fear, and the fierce maternal protectiveness blooming behind Nina's eyes, and that only made the internal pressure more unbearable, because Nina cared. And Nina, unlike Drew, would not weaponize the truth against her. Willow sensed that if she told her mother the darkest secret of her life, Nina would take it, hold it, bury it inside herself, and never let anyone else near it. This realization, this emotional awakening, was another one of the adjustments spiraling through Willow's mind, a wild, chaotic reconfiguration that made her see Nina not as a last resort, but as her only hope. The day the dam inside her finally cracked did not come with fanfare. It was quiet, almost deceptively ordinary. Willow woke before dawn, her heart already pounding, her lungs tight with dread. Drew had confronted her the night before with a tone to calm, to measured, to precise. He asked questions he shouldn't have known to ask, questions that suggested he was remembering more than he let on. Willow felt his eyes on her long after he walked away, and she could no longer pretend she was safe. She could no longer hide behind Michael, behind her children, behind the illusion of normalcy she'd tried so hard to maintain. Something inside her snapped, not in anger, but in terror. She realized the truth was going to come out one way or another, and if she didn't take control of it now, Drew would seize that power and crush her with it. Her body moved on instinct as she sought Nina out, not with intention, but with desperation. She felt as if she were being pulled toward her mother by gravitational force, unable to stop herself even though she didn't know exactly what she would say. She tried to rehearse the confession in her mind, tried to imagine how Nina would react, but every scenario fell apart the moment she attempted to speak the words aloud in her thoughts. The admission felt too monstrous, too irreversible, too catastrophic. And yet, beneath the terror, something new was happening, something wild, reckless, and liberating. A shift that bordered on madness. The idea of telling Nina the truth no longer filled her with dread alone. It filled her with a twisted form of relief, a craving for release so intense it bordered on obsession. It was as though her mind had finally realized that confession was the only path that could break the chains Drew was tightening around her. This was the new, deranged adjustment unfolding within Willow, a state where fear and freedom blended until she could no longer distinguish one from the other. A place where confessing to attempted murder felt like salvation rather than ruin. A psychological tipping point where the truth became the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. Willow knew that once she told Nina, everything would change: her relationships, her safety, her identity, her future. But she also knew that Nina would stand between her and the storm that followed. Nina would protect her, hide her, fight for her, even if it meant going to war with Drew, with the law, or with the entire world. In that moment, Willow realized she was ready to surrender her secret, not because she wanted forgiveness, but because she wanted freedom. She wanted to step out of the prison her mind had become. And Nina, the woman she once rejected, was now the only person she trusted to hold the key. Nina could already sense that something inside Willow was unraveling long before the rest of the world noticed, an invisible fracture spreading through her daughter's composure with each passing day. There was a tremor in Willow's breathing, a stiffness in her posture, an urgency in her voice whenever Drew's name entered the conversation. Nina watched these shifts closely, silently, knowing instinctively that something catastrophic was buried beneath them. And because her connection to Willow had always been fragile and easily broken, she reached for this moment with a kind of desperate tenderness, determined not to let it slip away. If she pushed too hard, Willow could retreat. If she hesitated, Willow could collapse alone. But this time, Nina refused to let her daughter drown in secrets the way she once had drowned in her own. She intended to pull everything into the light, no matter how painful, because something in Willow's eyes told her that the truth was not only necessary, It was the only thing keeping her from suffocating under the weight of her guilt. Nina did not know the details yet, but she knew Willow was hiding something enormous, something that had been eating away at her from the inside. The pressure around them was palpable, like the air in the moments before a storm tears open the sky. Nina suspected the truth was tied directly to Drew, and the moment Willow's voice faltered while mentioning his recovery, Nina's heart clenched in awareness. She could feel the fear radiating from Willow, the way her daughter's fingers twisted anxiously as though she were trying to hold herself together physically because emotionally she was falling apart. Nina wanted to shake her, to demand answers, to force the truth out of her. But she also knew that Willow needed space to choose honesty for herself. Still, Nina prepared for the moment she would have no choice but to press harder, to push Willow to reveal what really happened that stormy night, and what her conscience had been carrying ever since. Nina's instincts told her that Willow needed someone to force down the walls. She needed the kind of relentless compassion only her mother could give her. She had already decided, long before Willow realized it herself, that she would defend her daughter at all costs. She had sworn privately to protect Willow unconditionally, even if the truth was far darker than she dared imagine. Nina understood the stakes better than anyone. She had faced the collapse of relationships, reputation, and self-worth more times than she cared to remember. But losing Willow, losing her after fighting so hard to reconnect, was a cost she would not pay. If this was her final chance to bond with her daughter, she would seize it with every ounce of determination she had left. And when the confession came, as Nina prayed it eventually would, she knew she would lock it away inside her heart and never let it escape. She would silence anyone who dared breathe suspicion. She would carry the burden if Willow could not. She would protect her from the world, from the law, from the consequences, and even from Drew. If necessary, Nina would take the truth and bury it so deep that not even her enemies could resurrect it. She would keep it because she loved Willow with a ferocity she once feared admitting, and because she knew the truth could destroy her daughter if the wrong person learned it. What Nina could not fully anticipate was the horrifying depth of Willow's guilt. When the truth finally cracked open inside Willow, when she stood on the edge of confession with her entire body trembling, Nina understood immediately that this was not a simple mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a wound carved out during a moment of psychological collapse, a moment where something inside Willow snapped violently enough to turn her into someone she didn't recognize. Willow would eventually admit that something shattered inside her the night she pulled the trigger, something raw and feral and desperate. She would confess that Drew had taken everything from her, her family, her sense of safety, her identity, and in that storm, in the chaos of her spiraling emotions, she felt she had no choice but to act. Whether or not this was the truth mattered less than the fact that Willow believed it. The guilt had been poisoning her ever since, and Nina knew that releasing this secret was the only way for her daughter to survive mentally. The idea of hearing the confession directly from Willow's perspective, of finally understanding the chaos inside her daughter's head the night of the shooting, was something Nina feared and longed for in equal measure. She wanted to know how Willow justified pulling the trigger. What emotions had driven her to the brink? What voice inside her had screamed loudly enough to drown out morality? Nina imagined Willow struggling to articulate the storm of fear, betrayal, anger, and heartbreak that had twisted inside her, and she braced herself for the moment the truth would spill out uncontrollably. She prepared to be the anchor Willow latched onto when the waves finally swallowed her. The question that lingered in the air like smoke was whether Nina would become the keeper of this monstrous secret. Would Willow trust her enough to confess that she had shot Drew and rely on Nina's silence to keep her safe? Everything pointed toward yes. Every sign, every tremor in Willow's behavior, every crack in her composure revealed a daughter who was barely holding herself together, desperate for someone to shield her from the consequences she feared most. And Nina, for the first time in her life, had the power to be the hero Willow needed. But the shocking truth was this: Nina was not planning to simply shield Willow from the fallout. She was preparing for war. If Drew regained enough clarity to threaten Willow's freedom, Nina would strike first. If Michael began to suspect Willow's involvement, Nina would step between them without hesitation. If the legal system moved to reopen the case, Nina would manipulate every judge, lawyer, an official she needed to in order to keep Willow safe. Nina would not allow the world to turn her daughter into a criminal. When she believed Willow had acted out of trauma rather than malice, and inside Nina's growing determination was a dangerous transformation, a new kind of control, a new kind of obsession. Nina had spent months trying to rebuild her relationship with Willow with patience and love. But now that she sensed her daughter's vulnerability, something fiercer awakened inside her. She was no longer simply a mother fighting for her child's affection. She had become a guardian ready to burn down everything in her way. This was not kindness, it was protection sharpened into a weapon, fueled by years of regret and longing. As Willow began to lean into Nina's support, the bond between them deepened into something intense and alarming. Willow saw Nina as the only person she could trust. Nina saw Willow as the person she had been waiting her entire life to save. The fusion of these two needs created a dangerous alliance, one that could unravel Drew's life entirely. And as the truth of the shooting began to surface in tiny emotional fragments, Nina realized that she was no longer simply supporting Willow, she was actively enabling her. She was feeding Willow's desperation with promises of unconditional loyalty. She was reinforcing Willow's belief that Drew had deserved what happened. Nina was shaping herself into a shield that could and would strike back if necessary. This newfound alliance spiraled into something even darker when Nina began imagining scenarios where she and Willow would work together to undermine Drew, to silence him, to strip him of any power he might regain. Nina started planning without realizing it. She observed Drew's movements, studied his habits, gauged the strength of his suspicions. She prepared strategies in her mind, ways to keep him confused, ways to redirect suspicion, ways to protect Willow if he ever regained full memory. The more she thought about it, the more obsessed she became. She was no longer reacting to danger. She was preparing to control it. The real shock came when Nina's obsession fused with Willow's unraveling guilt, in a way neither of them could fully recognize. Willow felt safer around Nina than she ever had with Michael, Drew, or anyone else in her life. Nina felt powerful and needed in a way she had long craved. Together, they formed a silent pact neither had spoken aloud, a pact built on fear, guilt, love, and desperation. And this, more than anything, was the new, terrifying adjustment in both their lives, an unspoken, unstoppable alliance between mother and daughter that had the potential to destroy Drew. Before he ever realized he was in danger, the truth was no longer just a secret, it was a weapon, and Nina was ready to pull the trigger for Willow if the world ever dared to threaten her again. Nina could feel the momentum shifting long before anyone else realized that the battle lines had already been drawn, a slow but unmistakable tightening of resolve in Willow's posture, in the way she spoke about Wiley and Amelia with a firmness that hadn't been there before, in the way her voice cracked when she mentioned being pushed aside one too many times by Michael and manipulated into silence by Drew. Something was changing inside her daughter, something fierce and unrelenting that had been buried under guilt and fear far too long. And Nina recognized that shift instantly because it mirrored the same transformation she herself had undergone years ago when she decided she would no longer let anyone control her or dictate her relationship with the people she loved. Now, she watched Willow piece together that same steel, slowly but surely, as the young woman realized she could no longer afford to be passive. Not when motherhood and autonomy were at stake. Willow had tasted vulnerability for too long, had bent to the emotional pressure of both men, had allowed Michael's righteousness and Drew's veiled authority to trap her in a cage she didn't even notice forming until it was nearly sealed shut. But now, with the storm of her own secrets brewing beneath the surface and the fear of exposure always threatening to erupt, Willow discovered a new instinct rising inside her, one that pushed her not toward retreat, but toward reclaiming the parts of her life she had allowed others to take from her. The first spark came when she realized how deeply she wanted Wiley and Amelia back under her wing, not simply as their mother, but as the only person who could truly protect them from the emotional fallout that had been silently spreading through the Corinthos household like rot. She could no longer ignore the tense undercurrents she felt when Michael discussed parenting decisions, the unspoken judgments, the attempts to moderate her influence as if he alone had the right to shape their future. Nina saw those moments too, saw how Willow grew smaller each time Michael undermined her, until one day she simply stopped shrinking. It was astonishing, electrifying even, to watch Willow reclaim space she once surrendered without thought. Nina became her anchor, her strategist, her quiet source of strength, guiding her through the labyrinth of legal threats, moral dilemmas, and emotional landmines that came with custody battles. But what Nina had not expected, what nearly stunned her into breathless awe, was Willow's sudden revelation that she also wanted Scout, that she was willing to go further than anyone imagined, not out of greed or spite, but from a need to protect the child she had bonded with during Drew's absence, and during the darkest emotional chapters of her life. This desire threw everything into chaos, because seeking guardianship of Scout meant challenging Drew directly, countering his every move, and rejecting his attempts to hold emotional authority over her. It was a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. Willow knew it, Nina knew it, and yet the fire inside Willow burned too fiercely to back away. For months, Drew had controlled the narrative, controlled the investigation into the shooting, controlled the guilt pressing against Willow's chest so mercilessly she could barely breathe. He had kept secrets, shifted blame, wielded emotional manipulation dressed up as concern. And Willow had endured it because she believed she owed him something, believed she deserved punishment, believed she needed to keep the peace to survive. But now, as she sought control over Wiley, Amelia, and Scout, Willow discovered a terrifying truth. She was done surviving. She was ready to fight. And the moment she realized she no longer feared Drew was the moment the ground beneath them began to shake. Michael became the second enemy, though neither of them would ever admit it aloud. Michael's self-righteous certainty, his obsession with control, his need to dictate the moral tone of every decision, became a wall Willow no longer wished to respect. He blamed, lectured, and demanded obedience while pretending the custody of their children was a cooperative effort. But Willow could see the truth behind his carefully crafted exterior. Michael wanted dominance. He wanted final say. He wanted every emotional bruise she carried to be overshadowed by his own carefully curated sense of justice. He did not understand the depth of Willow's trauma, nor did he care to. He did not see her unraveling, her guilt, her fear, her desperation, because he was too busy believing he alone knew what was right. When Willow finally stood up to him, when she allowed herself to imagine a future where she not Michael held the ultimate say over Wiley and Amelia's lives, she felt something inside her snap back into place like a bone finally healing, in the correct position. And Nina, witnessing all of this unfolding with a mixture of pride and dread, realized the magnitude of what her daughter was stepping into. This was not a quiet reclaiming of motherhood. This was the beginning of an emotional war. Willow was not simply fighting for her children, she was fighting for her identity, her autonomy, her freedom from two men who had shaped her life for too long. Nina saw how the pieces aligned, how Willow's desire to protect Scout symbolized her final break from Drew's psychological hold, how the custody battle for Wiley and Amelia represented the collapse of Michael's influence over her. These were not small acts of rebellion, they were seismic shifts, and Nina knew what came next. People would push back, Michael would feel threatened, Drew would feel cornered, and both would underestimate just how far Willow was willing to go now that she had finally tasted the idea of controlling her own destiny. What neither man understood and what only Nina sensed fully was that Willow's transformation had been fueled by more than fear or resentment. It was driven by a newfound obsession with reclaiming every piece of herself that had been lost in the turmoil of guilt, secrecy, manipulation, and emotional collapse. Seeking custody of Scout was the clearest sign, yet that Willow no longer accepted the narrative that Drew owned the child emotionally or morally. She believed she could give Scout stability, warmth, and a life free from the volatile storm Drew carried behind his eyes. It was a radical shift, a dangerous shift, but Willow embraced it with a clarity that stunned even herself. Nina supported her unconditionally, not only because she loved her daughter, but because she recognized the truth beneath Willow's actions. This was not about revenge. This was about reclaiming her voice. This was about stepping out of the psychological shadows Drew and Michael had built around her. This was about becoming the mother she wanted to be, not the mother they allowed her to be. And Nina, having been silenced too many times in her own life, saw this battle for what it was, the rebirth of Willow's agency. Together, they were becoming something formidable to women united by blood, trauma, and a shared refusal to be controlled any longer. As the custody battles loomed and the emotional storms intensified, Nina sensed a new reality emerging, one where she and Willow were no longer isolated fighters, but a single unstoppable force, ready to challenge any man who dared stand between them and the lives they intended to reclaim. And in this rising storm, Nina knew one chilling truth. Willow was no longer the frightened girl trapped between guilt and obligation. She had become something far more dangerous, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for.